Welcome to our special presentation on Western alienation here on Global News.
Now, over the next half hour, we're going to look at the issues that have led to where we are today, the players involved, and the way forward.
But to go forward, we should look to the past and get an idea of the representation Alberta and Saskatchewan have sent to Ottawa since joining Confederation.
Now, over the course of the first 50 years in Canada for the two provinces, results were mixed, but a turning point came in 1958. That was when John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservatives took all but one seat in the two provinces. It was a victory built largely on a road to resources policy that stoked northern and western interests. Since that election, Conservative parties have dominated, winning almost 95% of the seats contested between the two provinces. And of course, in 2019, not one seat went to the Liberals, and just one to a party other than the Conservatives. But even since 1958, there's been a sense of, well, constant malaise and sometimes vigorous protests when it comes to how the West has viewed the Federation.
Joel Sednick spoke with a political scientist to learn more about the ins and outs of the movement.
The idea of Western alienation has flared up at different points during our history. What makes this flare-up different than in the past?
I think what's really different about this flare-up is that it coincides with this existential moment for the oil industry and the oil and gas industry here in Alberta that is facing an extraordinarily uncertain future because of concerns about climate change. And that means that we have both the traditional Western alienation layered on with fear about economic dislocation and change to the source of prosperity for the province.
The goal of political movements, I would assume, would be to impact change. And when we look back on this issue both historically and I guess now currently, can we point to anything that tells us, okay, this is going to make a difference either in legislation or how we are heard as a province in Ottawa?
One of the ways that Western alienation has had an enormous effect on Canadian politics has been as a driver of change in the party system. And so we've seen it both the sort of left populists, the progressives, the CCF, which then become the NDP, come out of the West, and they change Canadian politics in all kinds of ways. By the same token, we can think back to the Reform Party that broke apart the Progressive Conservative Party's coalition and changed the Canadian party system really profoundly. So, there are certainly policy dimensions that come with that, but the fundamental driver is changing the shape of political competition. And, when we look across the history of Canada, really that has been the biggest impact, in my view, of these periodic uprisings of Western alienation.
Indigenous rights, First Nations rights, play a role in here, and I feel like we don't often hear a lot about that. How would you say Indigenous rights play a role in this issue?
Well, I think, if we look at the Western separatism movement specifically, it really is a movement led by and for the most part followed by white men. There is very little consideration of Indigenous rights, and I think even a lack of appreciation of the historical and legal relationship between Indigenous communities and the Canadian Crown. Not just the Canadian government, but the Crown. And so when you talk about breaking up Canada, what you're doing is talking about breaking up the relationship between Indigenous communities that have signed treaties with the Crown. And that is something that anyone who's talking about taking the West or parts of the West out of Confederation needs to take into account and take very seriously.
One of the hot points in the relationship between Alberta and Canada came in 2001 when 6 prominent Albertans sent Premier Ralph Klein what is now known as the Firewall Letter.
Now, some of those demands have been recycled into what's called the Fair Deal Panel, examining Alberta's place in the Federation. Here's Adam McVicker.
9 proposals, all aimed at giving Alberta a fair deal in Confederation. While experts say many of the ideas are possible, they will come at a cost. Take establishing an Alberta pension plan. No other province has ever attempted to pull out of the CPP, and it has upsides and downsides.
So Alberta withdrawing might have some short-term gains for us. It might have some short-term costs for contributors elsewhere, but who knows what the future holds, and it would be riskier for Alberta to have its own pension plan.
Collecting our own income taxes could also be a costly endeavor. TUM estimates establishing a separate revenue agency would cost $500 million per year to duplicate administrative agencies. Meanwhile, Alberta's contract with the RCMP expires in 2032. It costs the province $235 million every year, and rolling out a new police force would take a decade. That will add to what the province is paying now, but the benefits aren't solely about costs.
Does it achieve a non-cost benefit in terms of being able to deploy people more quickly, respond to crime initiatives like rural crime more effectively?
While the costs may be high to achieve these proposals, one of the original signers of the firewall letter says the benefits shouldn't be measured in cost alone.
I think the costs are real, and those of us who are promoting these ideas should not pretend that those costs aren't there. But we should recognize that the costs are in the government, the benefits go to the population of Alberta.
A report on the panel's findings will be released in March, giving Albertans a better idea of just how costly a fair deal may be. Adam McVicker, Global News.
Coming up, economic issues have dominated this debate for a long time. What are they, and how do they translate today? We'll have that next.
There's no communication right now between the West and the East, and until you solve that and have them working together like adults, you'll never get fair share of anything.
And just after the October election, Ipsos polled Canadians on divisions within the country, and 59% agreed we are more divided as a country than ever. 39% disagreed with that statement.
And in our region, the number was massively higher. 79% in Alberta and 77% in Saskatchewan believe there is a problem. On the questions of whether we would be better off as a separate country and getting its fair share, our two provinces are in relative lockstep with each other.
And joining us with more on the poll and its findings is Kyle Braid, Senior Vice President of Ipsos, and he joins us now from Vancouver. So Kyle, what's your first take on this?
Well, you covered it. Canadians are grumpy. They see a country that's divided. I mean, you certainly mentioned the numbers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are much higher than everywhere else, but it's not just there. Canadians across the country can see what's going on. It's a majority in every region of the country who think that the country's more divided than ever.
So, Kyle, the sentiment of separation is clearly stronger here in Alberta, but right across the country, especially in Quebec, those numbers do not bear out.
No, they don't. This is, we talk about Western alienation and that issue. It's really Alberta and Saskatchewan that are speaking up right now. 33%, looking at the idea of separation in Alberta, 27% in Saskatchewan. For comparison, Quebec, which is always the highest number, is only at 26% now, so lower than both of those two prairie provinces. And the numbers are in the, near the 10% range in the rest of the country. So really, it's about Alberta and Saskatchewan and their particular issues today.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Kyle.
Well, perhaps the biggest flashpoint issue in this entire debate centers on equalization.
Now, many Western politicians have pointed out that the formula hurts Western provinces, especially Alberta. Fletcher Kent takes a look at the complicated issue and how it's being used.
Well, equalization is about numbers, lots of them. But the equalization debate, well, that involves a lot more emotion.
Why does the federal government want to take our tax dollars and redistribute them, but not allow us to develop the wealth which pays for those bills?
And this is an environment that is very, very different than it has been just even a few years ago and most certainly 10 years ago.
Now, Mel McMillan studies equalization and notes there is a lot of rhetoric involved here.
I think many politicians find it advantageous to confuse the issue.
Now, in simplest terms, the program takes money from federal taxes and distributes it to the so-called have-not provinces that need help paying for services like healthcare and education. Now, the calculation is based in part on how much revenue a province would receive if it adopted the average national tax rate. And by that math, Alberta is not poor. We have the highest average income, 30% higher than the national average. Alberta also has just 11% of the population, but people and businesses in the province contribute 14% of the total federal tax revenue. Also, we're young, so we don't draw as much from CPP or from old age security. As such, Albertans send about $20 billion per year more to Ottawa than comes back through all transfers. Now, many politicians tend to seize on that number, but McMillan says that's not all about equalization. It also includes other transfers, and the rhetoric and confusion is often about playing the victim.
I think it is potentially dangerous, or at least confusing, and I think people are better able to make decisions if they understand the facts.
Now, McMillan doesn't think the formula is perfect. Historically, Alberta governments have relied on oil royalties to help pay for services, and much of that revenue has disappeared. Equalization, well, it doesn't do very well handling such big and sudden changes. On the other hand, Alberta chooses lower taxes, and the argument could be made that why should the rest of the country subsidize those choices? For example, if Quebec chose to lower its taxes, Albertans would likely be outraged if Ottawa sent more money east to compensate. So the answers, well, they're not exactly clear, but this is an important debate. But McMillan says it ought to be just about the numbers and the details and less about being a political tool that seizes on feelings of victimization and alienation.
So what would this type of special presentation be without a robust discussion on the issues facing us?
For that, we've brought in our provincial affairs reporter, Tom Vernon, to lead that discussion with some guests who have a wealth of opinions. Tom?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks so much, Linda and Gord. I'm joined by Ryan Jesperson from 630 CHED in Edmonton and Danielle Smith from Global News Radio in Calgary. Now, you guys have your ear to the ground. You hear from listeners every day on these types of issues. Equalization, it's a very complicated topic. Has it been weaponized by prairie premiers?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course it has. And it's smart strategy from prairie premiers that are looking to get the best deal they can for their jurisdictions. I mean, that's essentially their job description, isn't it? So it's no surprise that Jason Kenney has as a tactical politician, has an understanding of the potential. And I think Fletcher's piece touched on something, and that's the fact that most Canadians, whether we admit it or not, are quite confused about how equalization actually works, and that's perfect for politicians.
Yeah, what's your sense, Danielle?
Well, it didn't always used to be this way. I spoke with Tom Flanagan, who was one of the original authors on that firewall letter, and he said they didn't include equalization in that letter because it wasn't a flashpoint at the time. And I think this is something to understand about Albertans. As long as they feel the formula is fair, as long as they feel that they genuinely are helping out other provinces who can't pay their own way, who don't have the same revenues, there isn't going to be this flashpoint. But I can point to the exact moment where it became an issue. Became an issue when Francois Legault was bragging about the fact that his province had yet another surplus and was going to be able to pay down debt, and then said, but we don't want to have a pipeline going through our province. We don't want Alberta's dirty oil. And then the very next day, it turned out there was extra money in the Equalization Fund, and Finance Minister Bill Morneau gave them $1 billion. It was because of those things being connected that people said, wait a minute, you don't want us to be able to continue with our economy, growing it, generating this revenue, but you want the revenue? And that's when it became a flashpoint. I think it was weaponized by a Quebec premier, not by the Western premiers.
Well, and I'm curious, so you talked about, developing our economy here. Do you think economic anxieties out here in the West add to the anger with this formula?
Absolutely it does. I mean, I think if we were able to do well, if we felt like we were able to build pipelines, get our economy back going, I can tell you, I think the issue of equalization would fade almost to nothing. One thing that still does need to be addressed, though, and even Joe Ceci, when he was finance minister, addressed this, is this fiscal stabilization formula. It's designed to hurt Alberta because it has a cap on it. Jason Kenney's talked about this. If it didn't have a cap on it, we would be getting $700 million from that fund, and we didn't get that. So I think that regardless of what your political leanings are, if you've got both the NDP and the Conservatives saying that part of the formula is not fair, then it's not fair.
Okay, one thing we have to keep in mind, Tom, though, to be real, and I'm certainly not going to defend Quebec's premier's position on pipelines or anything else, Danielle, that's for sure. But in so many ways, as Quebec brags about having a surplus and paying down debt, and for that matter, offering affordable daycare and everything else, Alberta brags about no sales tax. And it is undeniable that if Alberta taxed its residents the same as almost every other province taxed theirs, we'd be running a surplus, and this would be less of a conversation. There would be no deficit, and that's something we conveniently conveniently ignore because we've convinced ourselves that it's unpalatable, the idea of a consumption tax in Alberta.
Yeah, a lot to talk about on Western alienation. We'll be back with Ryan and Danielle in a few minutes. We'll go back to you, Linda and Gord.
Thanks, guys.
So not everyone is high on the idea of fueling an east-west divide. We're going to go to Lethbridge and find out how they're talking about the idea of Western alienation. Next.
Well, we definitely need some more attention from the federal government, absolutely. The Fed's got to get involved in some of these pipeline issues, and definitely someone's got to make a stand.
There are pockets of our province that have weathered the economic downturn better than others and are not necessarily hot on the idea of Western alienation.
Now, one of those is the Lethbridge region, an area where agriculture, not oil and gas, is among the key economic drivers. Tom Ralston has more.
Are you getting a storm in Colorado too, or just us?
Leighton Kolk has been in the cattle business for more than 30 years. He now runs his family farm north of Lethbridge. He says business these days is okay, but not without challenges, and understands why there's frustration among many Albertans as the province tries to claw out of a downturn.
It's been a producing province, and we love all our consumers wherever they are, but we still need to have the ability to do business.
Kolk feels there is a disconnect between what's important to primary industries like farming and Ottawa, but doesn't believe breaking up the country is the answer.
Recognizing the value of each player, each province, each government is a much better approach.
Agriculture is among the industries that have helped shield parts of southern Alberta from the energy downturn. Political sociologist Trevor Harrison believes those conditions have helped quell separatist sentiments in this part of the province.
Some way or another, we have to diversify the economy. Southern Alberta has done that to some extent. The rest of the province has to do that as well.
Back on the farm, this longtime cattle producer hopes interprovincial fences can be mended, with everyone getting an equal say.
It's like a relationship. If there's one person always willing to take and not willing to give, at some point that relationship falls apart.
Tom Ralston, Global News.
Now, when Brad Wall stepped down as Premier of Saskatchewan in 2018, he helped form the Buffalo Project. It's a self-described group of concerned citizens in Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Buffalo's members are federalists, not separatists. They want Premiers Scott Moe and Jason Kenney to continue pushing for a new deal for the West. The Buffalo Project is a behind-the-scenes effort, and it's not known how many members there are or how much money has been raised. Critics liken it to an American-style political action committee.
There's lots of people making noise out there. I don't see a lot of people focused on really important solutions for the long-term vision of this country. And so if that means we have to stay a little quieter to do that, I think we're fine doing that.
The name Buffalo Project comes from a proposal in the early 1900s that would have made Alberta and Saskatchewan a single province. For more on the Buffalo Project and what it does and what its goals are, you can head to our website, globalnews.ca/Western Alienation.
The red-hot debate in all of this, what about separation? Is it a viable option? That's after the break.
So we've talked about the issues of alienation and what can be done to cooperate on both the federal and provincial level.
But there's also the issue of separation and a hardcore group of supporters who want to make a go of it on our own. Here's Silvana Benelich with that.
I've never felt this frustrated and angry in my life.
It's been a tough couple of years for Armand Lasante. He had to shutter the business he spent years building due to the economic downturn. With creditors calling and bills piling up, it cost him his marriage. The 50-year-old admits he's had some pretty dark moments.
I was upstairs in my bedroom, and I was, I had a gun in my mouth, and I was ready to do what I had to do, or what I felt at that time I had to do, because I couldn't handle the pressure any longer.
Lasante feels federal government policies are responsible for crushing economic growth in the West, and he's not alone. The Wexit or Western exit movement to separate from Canada has exploded since the federal election. The group has more than 270,000 members on its Facebook page. Hundreds of people showed up at recent rallies in the province saying the West wants out. Wexit has even applied for federal political party status.
We want people here to have a high quality of life, and it's only through self-determination, which can only come through separation, that we're going to achieve it. And we will achieve it.
But any talk of Western separation would need the support of First Nations, which have treaties with the Crown. One Saskatchewan chief says separation is not going to happen.
For decades, we have not had our voice heard. We have been somewhat alienated from discussions and whatnot. Welcome to our life. You don't see us crying and complaining and wanting to separate from the rest of Canada.
For Lasante, there's only one way forward for Western Canada. As for anyone who thinks Wexit is a bluff,
Oh, they think we're joking out here? This is no joke.
Silvana Benelich, Global News.
Now let's go to our panel for some final thoughts.
Tom Vernon is in Edmonton. Tom.
Yeah, that's right. So back with Ryan Jesperson and Danielle Smith. So obviously right after the election, the Wexit Facebook page and that movement saw a lot of action online. I assume you're hearing, Ryan, a lot of it on your radio show and on your text line as well.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I mean, I just want to correct that one fellow there at the end of the news story saying that this is not a joke. This is most definitely a joke. But what's not a joke is the fact that many Albertans are feeling alienated, and that's something that needs to be taken seriously. But what powerful commentary there from an Indigenous voice saying, welcome to our world. It doesn't solve any problem, and it creates about 1,000 of them to try to leave Canada. I will say this, if somebody hates Alberta's relationship with Canada so much that they want to just walk out, there's nothing stopping anybody from leaving, Tom.
Danielle, is it dangerous to ignore this sentiment, though? Do these conversations have to be had?
I think Jason Kenney's got the middle road. His fair deal really is a solution that I think brings Albertans together, just asserting more autonomy for Alberta and taking charge of those areas that have been left to federal jurisdiction. The reason it's the middle way, though, is because the Wexiters understand you can't separate if you can't collect your own income taxes, if you don't have your own pension system, if you don't have your own immigration program, if you don't have your own policing. So I think that the Wexiters see the fair deal as a means to an end, and so it's very likely that a lot of those policies are going to be implemented from Jason just because he wants to find that middle of the road. But there's no question in my mind. I think Wexit's going to put a full slate of candidates up in Alberta in the next provincial and probably also at the federal level, and they might even win a seat or two.
So that fair deal panel, the work is just
Danielle,
beginning.
I will bet you dinner right now that not a single Wexiter will get elected. I'll bet you dinner. Just like the People's Party of Canada was getting elected, just like the Freedom Party was getting elected, they can't get a seat, not a chance.
I think it depends on how much success Jason has. If he doesn't, if Premier Kenney does not manage to make some inroads on those fronts, I think you'll probably see it escalate. But it may also bring the temperature down if he is able to do a couple of things that move the agenda along.
All right, we got a dinner bet.
All right. Well, here we go. Well, we'll keep up to date on that on the radio listeners on 630 CHED and Global News Radio in Calgary. That work on the fair deal panel is just getting underway. We'll hear more on that in the spring. Lots to talk about on this topic for sure. Gord, Linda?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom.
Well, we want to thank you for tuning into our special presentation this evening.
And we hope that it has shed some light on the debates that surround our region and our place here in Canada. And of course, you can get more info and in-depth coverage of all the stories you saw here tonight at globalnews.ca/Western Alienation.